Okay, welcome to Tech Tuesday, number 74. And we're going to talk about evaluating strategies. So I'd like you to imagine the following situation. You have a client, and the client has a big problem. I don't know, let's say a competitor is about to enter his market and eat his lunch. And being the super duper IP strategist, you formulated a great IP strategy for solving the problem. And it's so great that you love it. But how do you know if that strategy is actually a good strategy? In fact, we can ask that about any IP action. And, you know, could you do better? Is what you're doing good enough? Is it even relevant for what you want to do? So that's one side of it. But the other side of it is that you have to explain not only the strategy itself, but also its quality to the people making a decision. Whoever's making a decision is going to ask, well, why don't we do something else? Why is this better? Okay. So how do you do that? Now, the whole issue, I'm going to talk just about, evaluating strategies and maybe IP actions, but the whole issue of how do you evaluate an IP plan is part of it. And there's no question that strategy is hard. It's hard to make strategy, and it's definitely hard to evaluate. And I'm going to try to give a few tools that might help you do it. And I'm guided by Richard Feynman that the biggest problem we have is fooling ourselves. Okay, we make a strategy, we love it, we think it does everything it should, but guess what? It has a big hole, which you will discover in another 3 years. Now, I've mentioned this book, Understanding by Design, before, but I think one of the important issues is not necessarily evaluating the strategy, but how about understanding the strategy? Do you understand your own strategy? And why is that important? First of all, if we're talking about something standardized, like a car, we can apply standard measures without understanding anything about the car. I don't know anything about cars, perhaps, but I do know what it means miles per gallon. So if I have two cars and one has better mileage, I know it's better, at least in that respect. If I have two cars and one of them feels nicer to drive, so again, I can know one of them is better. But strategy, I'm saying here is always unique, but I'll, hedge that later, is unique. So if you want to evaluate it, you have to understand what it is you're evaluating. Perhaps more important, understanding your strategy helps you build it and check it. And today, when we're moving into the world of AI, where AI does who knows what it does, if you don't understand what it's doing and why it's doing and what's happening, you can have a strategy that looks beautiful, but is actually a piece of garbage. Now, there's interesting articles that I found that talked about two different types of understanding, which are especially relevant when we talk about strategy, even more relevant when it's strategy which AI helped you put together. One of them is editorial communication, which means that you can explain what it is you're doing. As patent attorneys, we're wonderful at editorial communication. We do it every day. We talk to an inventor, we pretend we understand what the inventor said. We write a patent application which is clear and complete, and everybody agrees describes what the inventor did. And the other type of understanding, which we hope to get to, is personal integration, which means that you actually understand what's going on. Not that you can talk about it, but you can actually do it, use it, and so on. And the book Understanding by Design actually talks about that when you teach people, you first ask, what is the test that I'm going to apply? And then you build your course around that test. So it's really teaching to the test but starting from the test and not from the beginning. So a lot of talk. What does it mean to understand the strategy? So I believe that evaluating a strategy is a key way of figuring out the parts of the strategy and how they work together and how they're used. And the approach I'm taking is inside out. I'm looking at a strategy in two different ways. One of them is looking in, and one of them is looking out. Looking in means, how does the strategy work inside? You have different pieces, they talk together. And looking out is about how the strategy does what it does, or what it does to the outside world. As an IP strategist, the in is really important. And it's also really interesting. But the out is perhaps more important, because if you want to talk about it, people don't care what you have inside. Just like my car, we don't care what's in the engine, we care how much fun it is to drive. And the people outside also need to monitor if your strategy is doing what it's doing. So the looking out is often more important, definitely, to people paying our salaries. Now, as a side note, if anybody knows how to visualize the looking in part or the looking out part, let me know, because I'm really interested in that. What I'm going to do from here on is I'm going to show different measures that we can use both for looking in and for looking out of a strategy. And I will give you examples. And of course, these measures are not relevant to all strategies, but I think it's a good starting point. Now, why is they not relevant for all strategies? Because the strategy, its value, so to speak, depends on the details and the context and what it is your company wants to achieve. So what I've done is I've taken a single situation, I've given two strategies, and one of the reasons I'm giving two strategies is because it's much easier to compare two strategies and say, this one's better, this one's faster, this one looks better, than talk about some absolute measure for a single strategy. Now, usually you need to choose between multiple strategies, either because your bosses tell you, give me two strategies to choose, or because some methods of developing the strategy naturally create multiple strategy options, or maybe even just one strategy, but parametric. So when you change the parameters, you get a different strategy. And I'm not sure who came up with this first, but the opposite of a strategy is also a strategy. Otherwise, it's, too trivial. And when we make a strategy, we're always choosing trade-offs. So you're going to have more than one strategy no matter what. 2 weeks ago, I gave this example of a company, I didn't give it a name, called DripBot. They make a robot, it runs along an irrigation drip line, and it fixes the drip emitters as it goes along. Now, in our story, there are no competitors for this niche, which is checking and fixing drip emitters in situ. And there's reason to believe that the people selling drip equipment would prefer that the company not exist, because instead of fixing, it's much better for them to sell you a whole new drip system. And DripBot has a business goal, and if you don't have a business goal, it's difficult to talk about IP strategy. And the business goal is to monopolize the market of in situ refurbishing of drip lines. It just so happens that two IP strategies have been proposed. The first one, a monopoly strategy, is that we're going to prevent any other player from copying the critical features required in this type of product. And because there can't be any other players, people are going to have to buy from DripBot. And I'm calling that the monopoly strategy. And the second strategy, which I'm calling reachpast, is we want to prevent other players, meaning the drip manufacturers, from using a service like DripBot, even if it's going to be a different technology. And because they won't be able to use a different service, they're going to cooperate with us. So in a sense, you could say that the first strategy is aimed at end customers, perhaps, and the second strategy is aimed at potential cooperating companies. And of course, in the real world, we're not going to choose between the strategies. We're going to do a mixed strategy. You should definitely do both of these things, but how much effort to put in each one is depends. Looking out. So looking out, like I said, is perhaps the more important one, at least to the people who pay, is how does the strategy interact with the outside world? So first of all, there's no best strategy. Each strategy is a different trade-off. The question is, what's your appetite? Another very important point is it's a language that we should be using when we talk about looking out is business language or marketing language. It's not about IP. You could maybe even use the word API, application, whatever interface. And I divided it into three different types of measures. One of them is input. In other words, what do you need in order to set up the strategy? The second one is execution. What does the strategy look like from the outside while it's being executed? And the third one is the outcome, which really talks about the alignment between what the strategy is trying to do and what the people outside want to happen. First, let's talk about inputs. So, obviously, perhaps IP strategy will cost money, you need manpower, you need time, you need other resources. And some of your inputs are a little bit more abstract, like attention or data. And what I've done here is I've taken two measures, which for this imaginary strategy might be the most important inputs. One of them is how much data do you need in order to do a good strategy? And the other one is how many non-data resources do you need? And I'm doing a 2 by 2 or two-dimensional graph. And in blue, mono is a monopoly strategy, and reach is a reach pass strategy. And the way I see it, the monopoly strategy needs less data. Why? Because it's focused on what DripBot is doing. We're going to cover critical features for doing what we're doing. So we need to know less about the world. Okay? So it's more to the left than the reach one. And also, it's a more standard type strategy. So you need less attention and distraction of people in the company. So the resources you need are also lower. On the other hand, the reach past needs data about competition or potential collaborators. And you might even need that at the earliest stage where you're trying to figure out if it can even work. In addition, you need more resources because as you execute the strategy, you have to keep track of what the competition is doing. Otherwise, the strategy is not going to work. So you definitely need more research, resources, and more data. And we can also talk about which one needs to do more prediction about the future. But like I said, I only chose two measures. Execution. So any strategy has to be executed. And I want to point out that when you look from the outside, even if you don't know anything about what's happening inside, your IP strategy is expected that the execution will be messy because we know that when you do IP, you never get exactly what you wanted. And it's going to be intrusive because we know that IP interacts with a lot of things the company does, like marketing and R&D and so on. So even if nobody in the company knows what your strategy is and how it works, you're still going to be interacting with them. In addition, while it's being executed, it does interact with other parts of the company. And as you interact, you get pushback, you have interference, and so on. Now, another thing that you see from outside is how stable the strategy is. Imagine we have a strategy which requires us to file one patent uh, a month, and after 2 years, we expect to get one patent grant every month. If you've ever executed a strategy like that or a plan, you discover it simply can't happen. Turns out that some of the filings get delayed, some of them get rejected, some of them get allowed earlier. When these things happen, it looks like the strategy is not stable. When your strategy is not stable, it makes people feel uncertain. So now let's compare the monopoly strategy and the reachpast strategy. The monopoly strategy needs a lot less interaction with other parts of the company, maybe only the R&D. And it definitely appears to be more stable, or at least you're as stable as the R&D, because if the R&D doesn't invent, what can you do? And if they do invent, you file a patent. But still, when you get rejections, it looks unstable. The reachpast strategy definitely requires more interaction with other parts of the company. And it's inherently less stable because you're dependent on what multiple competitors are doing. And each one of these competitors might be changing what they're doing. So whether you want it or not, reachpast will definitely look less stable. There'll be something exciting happening every day. Now let's talk about outcome. The whole reason why we're doing a strategy is because we want something to happen in the world. And the biggest outcome is money. It's not all about the money, but usually you want money, income, we'll call it, or other outputs. But possibly more important, you definitely want to know if your IP strategy is going to work or if it's going to fail, and if it's going to fail badly. So we'll call it risk. And again, I gave you a two-dimensional chart. The monopoly strategy is more conservative. It has a more limited payoff because the only thing you can do is prevent people from copying you, but it doesn't necessarily prevent people from making a better, different product. And that gives you a risk of failure. Because if people design around what you're doing, then your strategy more or less failed. The reach path strategy has a higher potential trade-off because you're working with companies who are making money and they might want to use you to make even more money, which means there's more money to go around. And it's actually less likely to fail. I should say it will fail differently or less catastrophically, because even if, let's say, you have a hole in your patent protection, so the monopoly strategy, if you have a hole, you don't have a monopoly. The reach path strategy, it just means that instead of 4 potential collaborators, you have 3 potential collaborators. A much smaller and less painful failure. Okay, we finished applying the strategy. You expect there to be consequences. You expect things to change in the world, both in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, you have all sorts of trade-offs that you made. And if you made a trade-off, it means you gave something up. Maybe you gave up to take a bigger risk, but maybe what you gave up is a capability to do something. A company that needs ball bearings decides to buy them from a supplier. It means that they will not be developing their skill to make ball bearings and the price will not go down, just for example. In addition, the consequences in the long term, maybe it repositions your company, maybe your competitors push back, and so on. If you look at the chart on the right, the dashed line is where we are now, and each line, each row, reflects a certain parameter which might be of interest, a measure, if you like. And what I'm showing is blue dot is a monopoly, and the green is a reach past. And it changed. For example, market centralization. If you have a monopoly, centralization will go up because there's fewer people that can do what you're doing. If you're doing reach past, centralization will go down because more people want to do what you're doing, and you don't build a mechanism to stop them. So consider what the monopoly strategy will seal off your niche and reduce diversity and reduce competition. The reach past might do the opposite, which is encourage people to consider maintainability and maybe go out into other directions like automation of deployment. Hey, if I have a robot that walks on drip pipes, maybe I can use that robot to lay out the drip pipes. So these are additional measures which you can consider when you're comparing two strategies. And I think you can tell that unlike the first 6 measures I gave you, these 4 measures are selected specifically for the strategies. They're not just generic. Some strategies don't look at leverage, but don't look at aftermarket diversity. It's not a meaningful measure. The most important measures, though, are where you started from. So you got your marching instructions, and they probably included what business goals you need to support, what constraints you have on what you're allowed to do or resources, certain things, I'll call them do no harms, things you're not allowed to interfere with. And if you don't have any of these, you have to create them yourself. And any strategy can and should be measured based on these starting goals. But still, I reiterate, you have to create your own measures, both measures that you apply before you do anything, just in order to evaluate which strategy, but also measures that you use during the execution. And here's an example for the monopoly strategy. Before I apply the strategy, I should be evaluating how much will it cost in money and time for a competitor to avoid the IP I'm expecting to file. If the answer is 0, the IP has no value. If the answer is $100 million, it's super valuable IP. During the execution, one thing I have to measure is what's the rate of identifying valuable ideas? Okay, if I plan to file 10 patents in the next year, but R&D is only giving me 2 good ideas every quarter, that's a problem. Now, the reach path strategy would have completely different measures. The measure for before would be, do we or don't we expect that we can have equipment manufacturers ignore our IP? So we can say it has to be no more than 30%, because if more than 30% of manufacturers can simply ignore our IP, then our IP is not very relevant. But if one of the goals of this strategy was encouraging equipment manufacturers to collaborate, one of the important measures is, of course, how often are they cooperating with us versus how often are they avoiding us? The worst of all possible worlds is we write IP to encourage collaboration. Nobody collaborates with us, but the IP isn't as good at preventing copying, so people copy us. Not where we want to be. Now, there are few issues with making and working with measures, and one of them is that there's an infinite number of strategies, and I keep on saying you should create your own, but that's just a statement. But I want to be clear that the standard measures can't cover the entire space. And if they can, there's just too many and you have to choose some. But the method by which you make your strategy I believe, bakes in certain failure modes and certain blind spots. And here I just gave a list of a few ways of creating strategies. There's the one I call magic or Athena, pops out of your brain fully formed, or backwards design. I know where I want to do, and I ask what has to be true in order to get there. Or I have aggregation. I take a lot of little strategies and I glue them together so that they answer all of my needs. Or maybe I use an AI to search through the entire space of strategies and offer something. So one of the things that's going to happen before we select or even execute the strategy is instead of having a just a measure, we're going to want to try out the strategy. So maybe we'll do simulation, human simulation, machine simulation, hybrid simulation. A particular type of simulation is what's called red teaming. I do my strategy and you fight it. Another type of simulation is scenario analysis. And there's a lot of other prediction methods. Okay, now let's talk about looking in. Now, if we have a taxonomy for different types of IP strategies, it is possible to have standard measures for each one, maybe, and maybe even have typical values for each one. The internal world of strategies, I believe, is less variable than the outside world, but I could be wrong. And a few weeks ago, I suggested a taxonomy, but the taxonomy I suggested wasn't inwards oriented. What's perhaps more interesting is a monopoly strategy for sure, but also the reachpast strategy are relatively generic. So obviously each company would apply them differently, but if I tell you I want a monopoly strategy, it's often the first one that people present, even in the recent EPO IP bootcamp, that was the first one presented as a strategy, and it was definitely presented in a generic form. So if you have a generic form, you might also have generic measures. In any case, I'm giving you 4 different sets of measures you should look at as examples. One is the structure of the strategy. Another one is the flow of the strategy. I'm talking internal. Another one is a function. How does it, work? And the last one has to do with, can the strategy be followed? Let's start with structure. So a strategy, like a claim, is different parts and they have relationships and they have to work together. And I believe, not everybody agrees, that you have to have some slack, some wastage. In any case, here's 2 measures to consider. The first one is modularity. Experience shows us that usually an IP strategy is not performed as a whole as you planned it. Maybe you ran out of money, maybe the world changed. And something about the structure is how easy is it to take a piece of the strategy and replace it with another piece or not do it? Coherence is a completely different measure. And the question is, how does the different parts work together? You can have a strategy, I will file patents and I'll also file trademarks. Okay, the way I described it, there's no coherence. I'll file patents and I'll file trademarks that relate to the benefits that the patents are protecting. That has more coherence. In any case, the monopoly strategy appears more modular because I can always not file a patent. It's not so simple, but it looks that way. And it also looks semi-coherent because often the patents we have don't have a strong interaction with each other. The reachpast strategy is more modular in the sense you can just ignore a partner, but when you talk about a partner, you have to consider the whole partner. And if you don't have coherence in the reachpast strategy, you're definitely going to have big gaps. The monopoly strategy usually has fewer gaps because it has layers of protection. So if you have 3 layers and you have a hole in layer 2, you don't have a gap. It's just a weakness. Flow. So strategies are executed, things are happening, and one question we ask is how fragile is a strategy? And we can think of a very complicated, sophisticated strategy, but it's much more difficult to control it. It's much more difficult to adapt it to new situations. It might be much more sensitive to what happens in the outside world and more places to have uncertainty. And another dimension is growth. We're doing the strategy, but as we're doing it, and definitely when we're done, what does it leave behind? Did I waste resources or create new resources? Am I using existing skills or creating new ones? And let's see our 2 examples. The monopoly strategy is less fragile because it ignores what's happening outside. It's going to work. I can just file the patents. But if I need to have a different strategy, if I need to actually change the strategy itself, it's not so easy. And more interesting, the monopoly strategy doesn't encourage any type of growth in the IP department or in IP abilities, or maybe a teeny bit. The reachpast strategy has to be flexible because, as we noted, everybody else is changing all the time. And it requires growth because it has to work with lots of different partners, and each one is different, different from each other, and different from DripBot. So you're definitely going to generate new skills. You might not want to, but you will. Function. Now, when I say function, unfortunately, I'm not talking about the nitty-gritty details, but on a top level. And let's first talk about leverage. So leverage is, a strategy uses an existing resource in a way that increases your power or effectiveness or aims your force better. And what people call better strategies, or at least fun strategies, often provide more leverage. Of course, with more leverage, you might have more risk of failure. And on the plus side, you might have more efficient use of resources. Efficacy is, does the strategy actually work? Does it do what the strategy is supposed to be doing inside? And you can see that both of these kind of relate to the difference between a simple, straightforward strategy and a complicated, high leverage strategy. So if we look at the monopoly strategy, it has higher efficacy because it's very likely to succeed in the denial. Each patent will provide its own little denial, but usually it has a much lower leverage. The reachpast strategy inherently can have more leverage because you're involving other players, but the efficacy might be lower because it's indirect. People don't actually have to cooperate with you. I just want to point out that I'm not talking about the outcome. Either one of the monopoly and the reachpast could have a higher outcome, the external outcome. I'm talking about how they work inside. Super important. Strategy is only valuable if you actually execute them. Otherwise, it's a piece of paper. That means they're dependent on the company's ability to execute the strategy, and that is often dependent on communication. Are you able to communicate? So let's look at simplicity and doability. Obviously, the more complex the strategy, it's more difficult to explain and more likely for something to break. Doability has to do with something somewhat different. If my strategy is novel, I don't mean novel, nobody did it before, I mean novel for the company, it's going to require more change. And change is hard. And some strategies have what looks like internal contradictions. We can argue if it's good or bad, or they contradict the existing company habits or culture momentums, and that makes it more difficult for people to follow the strategy. So if we look at the monopoly strategy, that's cool. It's simple, it's easy to explain, it's easy to do, not that getting people to file patents is ever easy, but it's simple and doable. The reachpast strategy has more moving parts, it has second order effects, it requires people in the company to think about other companies, not about themselves. That is not easy. So less simple and less doable. And of course, the most important measure, not the risk of failure, but will we fail? And it's probably non-numerical unless you really play around with the measures. And each strategy has different failure modes. Some of them have to do with the strategy itself not being followed, for example, internal, and some have to do with the interaction between the strategy and the outside world being problematic. And the process of strategizing, of building a strategy or thinking about a strategy, has to include identifying these different failure modes and figuring out how you're going to avoid them and assigning a risk of it happening. Now, I'm using the word risk. You might tell me, but there's uncertainty. Well, if you think that you can't put a number of a risk, then perhaps you do uncertainty type solutions, which are identifying warning signs that you're going to use during execution, or identifying directions that you can use to cure if something bad happens. So perhaps the flip side of failure is adaptability. And we can talk about each one of these failure modes and say, how well can our strategy adapt if that failure happens? So now your analysis rears its head again. It can possibly help us understand what causes these failure modes and how they can be solved, but there's lots of other ways to do it. What will probably happen is when you build a strategy, you will be allocating resources to deal with these potential insipid failures. And I'm just warning you that until the failure happens, people will say you don't need that resource, and that resource will be stolen or repurposed away from supporting the strategy. Okay, when do we do all of this evaluating of strategies? The answer is it's best to do it, in my mind, as we're creating the strategy. So here's a few examples. When we stress test a strategy, we can do it. When we are optimizing a strategy, we can do it. When we're putting together a strategy from different parts. When we define expectations, that's when we start talking about the measures. How much leverage do I want? How much reliability do I want? And here we get back to the fact that the monopoly strategy is generic. And you probably just say, let's do the monopoly strategy. So you probably evaluate after you create it. But more complex strategies, perhaps like the reachpast, you have to ask, can it even be done? So you have an evaluation period where you're checking to see what you can do. And at that evaluation period, you do evaluation. I've been talking about strategies, but obviously you can apply it to any type of IP action. Strategies have some particular issues to them. The longer term, which means that adaptability becomes important. The effect on others becomes much more meaningful because others have time to push back, and because that's usually why you do a strategy. Strategies usually have a higher cost than just IP actions. And just as an example, if we chose a monopoly strategy, then the opportunity cost of choosing that strategy is much higher than the actual cost of any particular patent filing we do. But if you've ever worked with a company that you recommended 80% monopoly patents and 20% reach past patents, and they said, no, we only want monopoly patents, then when push came to shove and they needed them, it was too late. Okay, so that's a high opportunity cost. Another issue with a monopoly strategy, people look at you, they see what you're doing, and they say, okay, let's do a design around. And in fact, and this is a feature, not a bug, when you do a monopoly strategy, the fact that you have so many different patents on the same subject matter causes other companies to simply avoid what you're doing. And that could be intentional because you want other companies to avoid what you're doing. You don't want to sue them, you want them to be somewhere else. As there's a lot of other things that we can want to measure in a strategy, and I just want to talk about two. One of them is secrecy. You're doing a strategy. Can you keep it secret? And does it need to be kept secret? And the other one is we're doing a strategy usually because we want to manage or reduce uncertainty, the future. How well does your strategy do that? I've said before, we're not going to do taxonomy, but I believe, and I haven't, proven it in any way, that if you have a taxonomy for strategies, each element in the taxonomy might have natural measures or types of measures that are suitable for it. And since, at least in the standard practice, most strategies are one of, I don't know, 5, 6 kinds, this could cover a lot of what you're doing. I find the long tail of strategies to be more interesting, but not necessarily what we're going to do because the client might need something else. Okay, so I've been talking about the clients and evaluating the strategies that they need and so on, but let's talk about the strategist. And ask a simple question, how long does it take you to become an IP strategist? And you need experience. How do you collect that experience? The answer is slowly. But still, how do you collect it? Slowly. Maybe you do experiments, but it's very difficult to learn strategy from experiments because there's a lot of uncertainty, so you're not going to have a statistical sample. Strategies are adaptive, so you started in one place, but the strategy changed. So what exactly are you measuring? And you have a mixture of planning and reaction. And some strategies take years to play out. And success, everybody knows that it succeeded, but marketing says the IP strategy didn't do anything, but the company was sold because of marketing. And R&D says the same thing. And the CEO says it was his connections. And the COO says, no, it was his execution, her execution. So it's really difficult to know why and if a strategy succeeded or not. What I want to point out is these steps of planning and evaluation and comparing are perhaps a shortcut to building your ability as an IP strategist. And of course, you use these measures to evaluate strategies of other people. You see a company, they have an IP portfolio, doesn't matter if you want to buy them, they want to buy you, you just found it on the internet. You can start measuring their strategy in order to understand it and to be able to answer the question, how would I have done it differently? I'm sure you're wondering how much we should spend on evaluation. And the answer is, I don't know. And you might also be wondering if you evaluate the IP strategy on its own. And the answer is absolutely not, because the IP strategy is working with the company. So you have to figure out the bundle of the IP strategy and the company strategy. And when you finish all of this evaluation, it's not the end, it's the beginning. You're generating an input to business strategy, to non-IP functions, and so on. Some of what I said is relevant to other type of strategies that are not IP strategies, but IP is different and is special. It's counterintuitive, it's often ignored, has long timelines, but also short timelines. It's both rigid and flexible, and given a lot of lectures on that. So here's what I'm telling you to take home. Strategies should be evaluated before execution. Look inside out and outside in. And a combination of the two is even better. It's usually easier to compare two strategies, but usually you need to generate more than one strategy, so it's not extra work. You should be using strategy evaluation to help you create strategies, and that I believe, and you can convince yourself if I'm right or wrong, that understanding a strategy requires you to do some type of evaluation. And whether it's you doing a simulation or the CEO looking at the strategy as a black box, but still with behavior that needs to be evaluated, it's the same thing. You have an example of a company, they make ceramic items, they decided to sell them, and they want to monopolize a particular field, large area world covering. Okay, monopoly. Yeah. But what strategies might they follow, and what measures are good for evaluating these strategies from the perspective of the decision maker, in other words, the person paying for it? Okay, I am stopping the recording now.